Thank you. Well, good evening, Governing Board, to President London and Vice President Gonzalez, Superintendent Kyla, and to all of our constituents who are still with us during this first week of school. Excuse me. We are going to, okay, great. Thank you for the access. Review the agenda item, which we've talked about quite a bit as we were working on the budget development process. Once we hit the pandemic and then later would realize the economic impact that would have on the district and all of the communities throughout the nation. And so we built this budget, and the summary document talks about our process for how we built the budget with some unknowns in play, but at the same time, some understanding that there was going to be a change in the near future. A large part of that waiting for the state to adopt its budget. So the district adopted its budget on June 24th based on the information that we had from the May revise. We also shared with the board that there were projections for additional funding that we did not have and know with confidence to be able to place into the budget. And so we identified those particular items. But with the May revise, which included a negative COLA and a significant deficit factor for cash and deferrals, the district was facing a $16.5 million reduction, which we also placed a placeholder in that budget so that the district can have time to develop a budget reduction plan, and at the same time waiting to see how the state budget was going to turn out. We had some information based on what the legislative body proposed as a counter to the governor, and indeed he signed essentially what we shared on that night of the 24th on the 29th of June. So this is a summary of the changes. Essentially, there is no COLA, so there is no plus 2% COLA and negative 10% deficit. So there's zero COLA. So essentially, we're at 2019-20 levels. We will still have cash deferrals, which continue to concern us as it relates to the deferrals, which we projected based on the information that we had at the time, would likely be worse than those projected in May. So the district will begin to see cash deferrals in February of 2021, when the May revise projected that we would begin to see cash deferrals in April. And essentially that means that money that we will earn in the 2020-21 year, in this case, we will not receive it until the 21-22 year. So in summary, based on the cash deferrals, we'll receive approximately 70 cents on the dollar in cash based on what we've earned. So that continues to be a concern because it means that we'll still need to be very mindful as well as work through various funding strategies to reduce our spending, to either slow down some of our payables. And we talked about that, working with some of our vendors based on our cash deferrals and communicating that to them and what the district can do to maintain good credit and relationships. We want to make sure that we're able to meet our payroll obligations as our first priority. And so with that, that requires levels of strategy that we'll continue to work on and continue to lift up as we present to the board. The other thing is the ADA home hold harmless, which wasn't in the May revise, did make it into the budget trailer bill. We're pleased with that. At the same time, it's something that the district already had as written in the education code for provision. Our concern continues to be, which we'll look forward to as the January budget is presented or earlier, what about 2020-21 and ongoing while we're still in this process of adjusting, and as we heard earlier in the presentations, making sure that we're connecting with students and that we're able to claim the ADA based on our students participating, logging in, being able to connect with the district, in which we're doing tremendous work and effort to ensure that the tools and devices that students need will be utilized. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those resources that are supporting that effort. in addition to our school sites and teachers and other staff that will be supporting that effort. One of the other changes that we'll be making in the 45, well, in the budget for first interim, we projected that we were going to receive an increase of per ADA allocation for special education funding. That funding has now changed to 625 versus 645. We're adjusting that. Though the LCAP will be suspended this year, we still will show the expenditures for the LCFF budget on time by December 15th. December 15th coincides with the same timeline in which we'll be coming to the board with the unaudited actuals for 2019-20. And so during that same board meeting, we will likely present that same night, if not a board meeting before, our LCFF and LCAP spending projections. We wanted to make sure that there's a lot of language that's being shared. And so we wanted to make sure that as much language for our community members and our staff to be able to reference, which is commonly my standard, to be able to add more information for people to be able to reference and review. And again, these board agenda item cover sheets tell a story. And so going backwards to be able to say what we did and to help tell the story so that someone who may look 2 board meetings from now can follow along with what the process was for us to get to this place. And so based on the date that the state budget was adopted, that 45-day period, which we haven't had to do in quite a while, the deadline would be tomorrow, August 13th. And so we happen to have a board meeting that coincided with that. If a district did not have a board meeting that was within that time frame, a simple notification to the county office of ed that our board meeting is the following week would still suffice in the event that there are questions for that. During this 45-day period, we also received more details about the learning loss mitigation funds, which generated a lot of questions during the budget development. And as we shared, there just was not enough information for us to be able to put it into the adopted budget. We have now since added these resources and provided the list and resources and the amount that the district was awarded based on the specific criteria for each of these funding streams. And so with that, there is a link within the board agenda item for more details about these funds, but also here's the list. And instead of summarizing very specifically, because you'll see there's a lot of language about what these funds should be used for. One of the things that we are doing is in conjunction with us applying and therefore receiving access to these funds, there's some assurances. And one of those assurances is to develop a plan. Now, the key thing about this funding, which is very different than the state budget funding, in summary, the state said, district, we're going to essentially fully fund you for the 2021 year, but spend your money wisely because we're not going to be paid, we are not going to be able to pay you all of what you earned in cash in the same year. On the contrary, we have federal funds that are coming in through GEAR and coronavirus funding, which again is the allocation that the state received from the federal government. And then the governor builds a budget as to how he's going to allocate it to the various resources in response to the pandemic. So with this funding, we're going to give you a large sum of resources to be able to offset the losses, not only to the academic plan that your students would have been on and trajectory had the pandemic not happened, but it also says, by the way, you need to spend this resource by the end of the year. So this particular area, the district is charged with developing a plan to spend these resources and the other resources as well. But this one in particular, we have to spend it by December 30th, 2020. In addition to that, at the end of August, we have to report to the superintendent of public instruction how much we've spent thus far. And in the event that the district has resources remaining as of December 30th, 2020, within 30 days of that, so January 2021, the state will begin to pull back any remaining funds that the district did not spend. So it's a large amount of money. At the same time, it is a very accelerated spending plan and pace with very strategic components that are connected to it. And so, with that, there's a lot of work being done, a lot of strategy to make sure that not only we spend these resources, but some of the other resources that we've received, to include the ESSER funds that we did build in the budget, the $14.5 million. Those funds have to be spent by September 30th, 2022. So we'll be leveraging which resources, what are the provisions and requirements to spend for those resources, and which one should we utilize as it relates to a major spending plan by December, or a more streamlined plan that we can allocate and use through September 2022. In addition to that, we can also look to see how we can pay the differential for things that our staff may be doing above and beyond, or work that we have reallocated based on our needs to address these issues that learning loss can be utilized for. So one of the things that we also have been waiting for, and are really pleased to see the progress, is our conversations with labor, so that if there are things that the district needs to be able to address beyond what we've discussed, PPE, equipment and supplies for students, that we can address that with some of these funds. The key thing is we will not have these funds all year, and we will have to be very strategic about what we offset, and to make sure that we have resources in the spring to continue that work, with the unknown as it relates to when we will come out or be able to move to another phase from distance to blended. So we'll be continuing to be very strategic about that. This section talks about the ESSER funds that, again, we've already placed in the budget. We put placeholders in the budget at the time because we had just received notification of it as we were completing the budget development process. And then we began, prior to that, determining what expenditures we could utilize these funds for. So those budgets have been built and will be adjusted accordingly. And so, again, a full list of what activities these funds can be utilized for. And so, with that, what I'd like to show is the version. There isn't a SACS document for a 45-day revision. So ultimately, we create a pro forma budget to show the adopted versus with the changes, and then specific line items that show where the various changes were made. So with the 45-day revision, the unrestricted and restricted general fund revenue is at 637 million. I'm rounding dollars, and then the expenditure is 624 million. And so it's identified in attachment A. And so we're going to look at what attachment A looks like, which essentially is a pro forma, very similar look to the SACS report, listing our revenues, expenditures, and other expenditures and costs, and getting to our profit and loss and beginning fund balance. So it looks very similar as it relates to what we did. Now, what we did is to show, this is the, let me go to the unrestricted budget. So this amount looks just like the adopted budget, where this is where we were projecting where we're going to be, our estimated actuals for 2019-20. And then the 2020-21 adjustments live here in these gray areas. This is what the original budget showed. So for instance, we reflected that we were going to earn $349 million. That was with the deficit in place. We now, with a zero COLA and no deficit, have increased the LCFF budget by $30 million, which is the same amount that we projected that we were going to lose, somewhere between $30 to $35 million in reductions. We also, one of the other changes that was made to the state budget, the lottery allocation was reduced by $3. So you're seeing us reduce our lottery funding by $3, which is $1 million in reductions. So our net increase in revenue is $30 million. And you hear my dog in the background. It's $30 million for the district. With expenditures, you will recall that we had placeholders of non-position related expenditures that we utilize to make these temporary adjustments so that the district again would have time to staff would be able to recommend and the board approve reductions using the May revised projection. And so this is us where we reduce certificated salaries. We had the list with the previous budget of substitutes or overtime and other areas, and this is us replacing those expenditures. So that's why you're seeing in certificated salaries was $132 million, and now it's $139 million. That's us reversing those particular areas of temporary reductions. These net changes basically will show you the difference between expenditures before other financing and resources. And so again, you're seeing the adjustment there. For all changes of which we made no change in the 45-day, that's why you'll see a zero in this particular area. So when we adopted the budget, we had a net loss of $4 million to the P&L. And now with the adjustment, it's a net increase of almost $9 million. So this difference essentially takes this number and these two numbers and then nets it to determine what the difference is. Our projected beginning fund balance is the same. Where does that number come from? It's what we had in the same number that was in the adopted budget, which was our projection at the time for 2019-20 of 28 million. We're bringing that number forward. And here we projected that 28 minus the 4 would be $24 million with an ending fund balance. Now that we're able to put in more resources from the local control funding formula, zero COLA plan, we take the 28 plus the 8, and that gives us 37 million. And so therefore it's showing the net increase in the fund balance. These areas just are summarized. Now that if you look at the original budget, this unassigned, unappropriated line has multiple lines to it. This line was summarized for ease, but it shows, and we lifted up with what we did at adopted budget, we would have had an unassigned, unappropriated fund balance of $170,000. Now, currently, it's 11 point, almost 12 million. This number has changed since we printed this document because we also have to make adjustments for additional expenditures. And now that additional revenue changes are happening, we're continuing to make those changes that you will see and as noted in the board agenda summary by first interim. So what's changed since then that's not in this projection? The district settled, and on August 1st, the board approved salary adjustments for UAOS, ASME, and confidential. That's not here yet. Will be placed into the revised budget. Again, you'll see those changes at first interim. So that's why, and we knew those adjustments were coming. Had they come without the budget changing from the state budget projection, it would have increased the amount that we would need to reduce in the budget, or we would leave to look at other areas for cost avoidance for us to be able to afford those ongoing resources aside from any other additional revenue. So this number, by the time you see it at first interim, will again change again, because again, there are continuous changes that are being made to the budget. Now, this is the unrestricted budget. We also made significant changes to the restricted budget. All of the funding for learning loss that we discussed are all restricted dollars. And so you're seeing here the same format. This is the adopted budget, and you're seeing changes. And we've identified what resources, as listed above, have now been placed into, as you can see, the federal revenue line. So we've increased the federal revenue projection by $35.8 million. That's learning loss, gear, and coronavirus funds. We've increased other state revenue because based on the resource code, that's what determines where it goes. We've increased that by learning loss. And there was also a reduction in restricted lottery by $4 from the state resources. We've also reallocated the CARES Act based on the esser allocation. So the temporary adjustments that we made, we now have specific areas for Chromebooks, for PD to train our employees about how we're going to manage and navigate with the coronavirus. We trained our employees how we're going to navigate and manage with the learning continuity plan, how we're going to support students and teachers in distance learning. And so, with that, we've allocated various resources to be able to respond to that. And so, you're seeing, based on those projections, us moving it into this restricted resource. And then you're seeing us take the money that we temporarily put in and taking it out of the restricted area so that it can be appropriately placed, as we just reviewed, in the unrestricted budget. So what you're seeing is a lot of movement, which we shared with you before. Because this money is coming in federal resources, it makes the restricted resource budget look very healthy, which is growing the total expenditures. That also, and I'll go back to show this net change. Our reserve for economic uncertainty is based on the total expenditures of the unrestricted and restricted budget. Though one time and though a large quantity of resources, you see us changing the reserve by $1 million due to those increases. That's because the restricted budget, as well as the unrestricted, but the restricted budget significantly increased. And so therefore we place that reserve for economic uncertainty higher. Once that spending changes, by the time we get to the end of the year, you'll continue to see that adjust. But this type of movement of revenue and expenditures, even for, in most cases, the majority of it is an allocation for a semester, significantly changes what our financial budget projection looks like. The rest of the report essentially is a view for you to be able to see, and without the unrestricted and restricted, this ultimately is the unrestricted revised budget and the restricted revised budget, which looks very similar again to the SACS budget. So if you wanted to see it collapse and not separated with the defined areas that we reported to you on the side about why the change was made. And so this is essentially these last two pages are the summary of all of the changes that were made that were detailed above.